We're getting close to November 3rd, Election Day. But be prepared. Things will be different this November. Why? Here are 3 reasons. Number 1, be ready to go to bed without knowing the final results. Because so many people will vote by mail this year, it will take a lot longer to count ballots and report results. This is not a bad thing. It simply means our election officials are working carefully and not rushing to judgment. But beware of disinformation campaigns rushing to fill the airwaves and social media with claims of fraud, abuse, and other shenanigans. Consider the source and remember, the calls you hear from media on election night are not final results. Make sure that what you're hearing is based on official announcements from local and state election officials. Everything else is just noise. Number 2, voting in person will be a different experience. You may have always voted at the school or community center down the street, but this year a lot of neighborhood voting sites are being consolidated into larger polling places to keep staff and voters safe. You should get a notification if your polling place has moved, but you can always check at canivote.org. Canivote.org is a nonpartisan site hosted by the National Association of Secretaries of State, which, along with BPC and others, also hosts the Trusted Info 2020 campaign against disinformation. And yes, consolidated polling places and other public health precautions may mean longer lines if you vote in person. Number 3, voting by mail will be huge. Because of the pandemic, many states are expanding absentee voting. Even before the pandemic, 5 states already sent every registered voter a ballot in the mail about 3 weeks before Election Day. Another 29 states and the District of Columbia have what's called a no-excuse absentee voting system. That means you don't need any reason to vote by mail, you just need to fill out an absentee ballot request form. Many states will mail them to you if you're registered to vote, but if you aren't sure what your state does, go to canivote.org. And even if your state requires a reason for by-mail voting, many have expanded those excuses to include concerns about the coronavirus. In many states, you can already request your absentee ballot. Do your part to flatten the curve of absentee voting by requesting and casting your ballot early. Voting in the middle of a pandemic will be unlike anything we've experienced in the past century. But understanding your rights and being prepared ahead of time can help make sure your voice will be heard at the ballot box.
Welcome to this Bipartisan Policy Center webinar, Getting the Facts About Voting by Mail. My name is Matthew Weil, and I direct the Elections Project of the Bipartisan Policy Center. BPC held its first event about the 2020 election on January 16th, just 264 days ago. Even back then, we predicted an unpredictable election cycle. With just 4 weeks to go before Election Day, though, I am ready to admit that we may have undersold the craziness that would become of Election 2020. It was clear early on during this pandemic that voting by mail was going to be a key component of voting in November. We estimated back in May that upwards of 50% of the votes cast will be by mail, and I think the country will still hit that metric. Unfortunately, there's also much more misinformation circulating than I expected about voting by mail, and the concerns about safety and security of the process continue. That's why we're here today. This panel will dig below some of the flashy headlines to get to the truth. These are the experts, and they know how it works. While you watch, I want to encourage you to submit questions for the panelists, either on Facebook or YouTube in the comment sections, or on Twitter using the hashtag BPCLive. Today, we are lucky to have Grace Panetta moderating the panel. Grace is the politics reporter at Business Insider, covering the 2020 presidential and congressional elections with a particular focus on election administration, voting rights, and managing Business Insider's partnership with Decision Desk HQ and instant coverage of live election results. Her articles have been among the best at getting deep into these issues around voting by mail. Thank you for joining us, Grace, and the panel is yours.
Hi, thank you all so much for being here and for tuning in to this excellent panel on a Tuesday afternoon. As Matt said, my name is Grace Panetta. I am thrilled to introduce our stellar lineup of panelists. We have four amazing current and former election officials with us today. We first have Allison McLaughlin, the Deputy Election Director for Montgomery County in Maryland. She is the co-chair of the Election Officials Technical Committee with the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments, and she's held multiple positions within the National Association of Counties. We also have Amber McReynolds, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the National Vote at Home Institute, which is a nonprofit policy research and advocacy organization focusing on mail ballot use and administration. She's also the co-author of the book When Women Vote and was previously the Director of Elections in Denver, Colorado. We're also very lucky to have with us two secretaries of state who serve as the chief election officials in their states. First up, Maggie Toulouse-Oliver, who is New Mexico's Secretary of State since 2016. And prior to being elected to that role, she served as the county clerk for New Mexico's Bernalillo County, where she oversaw election administration. And she's also the president of the National Association of Secretaries of State. And then we also have Kim Wyman, the Secretary of State in Washington State. She was formerly the county elections director and auditor for Thurston County, and her office has worked extensively to modernize and secure Washington State's election infrastructure. Thank you all so much for joining us and for being with us today. So as we sit here today, we are exactly 4 weeks out from the end of voting in this election, November. Gone out to millions of Americans, and as of today, over 4 million people have already voted, according to the U.S. Elections Project. It's easier than ever to vote from home and vote by mail, but we're still really in uncharted territory with this election. So I want to start with you, Secretary Wyman. You've been running elections in a state that uses all-mail voting now for several years, and you and your office have been advising states throughout this pandemic who are trying to scale up their mail voting processes on a short timeline. So from your vantage point, 4 weeks out, do you feel that most states are now sufficiently prepared for the incoming crush of mail voting, and how are you seeing the landscape in the rest of the country?
Well, you have to understand, election officials are planners by nature, and we started planning for this election 2 years ago, and it has been our sole focus, and everything we planned on 2 years ago has changed, I think, across the board for every state. So yes, every state in the country, every election official from the state level all the way to the local level has had a singular focus of making sure that their election workers are safe, that their voters are safe, and that they can exercise their constitutional right to vote. And that's our sole focus, and we're working on it. Of course, I'm worried. I think every election official in the country is worried right now because so many variables have changed on a daily basis. We're fighting off misinformation and disinformation. And for many states, we are radically changing the way that we vote. So of course we're worried, but election officials, this is what we're built for. This is what we do, and we're going to step up and make it happen. So we're ready.
Great. And so Secretary Oliver, in addition to running New Mexico's elections, you also lead the National Organization of Other Chief Election Officials. So what are you hearing right now from your other fellow secretaries as to how this massive scaling up of mail ballots is going?
Well, honestly, I'm not hearing a whole lot right now, and I think that's because everybody is so incredibly focused on the job. So many states have already begun the voting process, as you mentioned. Today here in my state is the first day to vote early, the first day that absentee ballots will be put out in the mail. And so, this is what happens, sort of this quiet before the storm, while everybody is just incredibly focused on getting the work done. But what I have heard from my colleagues sort of leading up to this moment is that, of course, this has been an incredibly challenging year, a year like any of us has ever experienced. And, for the four, by the way, this amazing group of four colleagues on the call, some of my favorite people to work with in elections. There's a lot of collective years of election administration experience among those of us on this panel. I don't think any of us have ever seen anything like this. I know, for example, Secretary Wyman and her crew, right, they're in really good shape. They do this every single election, mail out a ballot to every voter. She'll probably quite possibly have more voters to mail out a ballot to this time than ever before, or I guess you mail them out automatically. Sorry, you may get more back than ever before. But In Mexico, we're experiencing this drastic shift between so many folks have preferred to come out early and vote in person, and now to see that shift transitioning to voting by mail. This is going to be the real challenge for all of our local county election officials, and one that they are prepared for. And still, we are going to have to see how the next 4 weeks transpire.
Definitely. And then so for you, Amber, your organization works with election officials across the country on how to improve both their processes and to educate voters and combat some of the misinformation that Secretary Wyman mentioned. So what are some of the biggest and most important concrete changes and new developments and processes your organization has been able to help local officials make in the run-up to these last 4 weeks of voting?
Well, there's a couple of things that we've certainly been focused on. First and foremost, there was a survey done earlier this year, actually, with Democracy Fund that highlighted the fact that most local election offices, 90% to be exact, have 5 or fewer full-time staff. And most of the time, that is not a communications person or it's not a data person. So they're doing a lot with very little in terms of resources. So recognizing that very large gap, we created a communications toolkit that's available on our website. It's an out-of-the-box messaging toolkit that includes digital assets, messaging, all of it, for election officials to basically take and use and brand with their own branding, and run with it. So we created that as a resource. We also host an operational toolkit that helps local election offices plan the resources they need to process mail ballots. So it allows them to input the information about how many ballots they expect to receive, and that helps them plan for staffing and equipment and all of those things. So we're helping in those ways, and then we're also doing our best to respond to the misinformation about the vote by mail process that keeps being perpetuated across multiple sort of platforms, and we're doing our best to dispel myths, put out good information, refer the voting public to the best and trusted sources of information, which are, in fact, the local and state election officials through websites like canivote.org and others that are managed by those officials. And we're also, frankly, encouraging the voting public to report if they see misinformation online or on platforms. Not only report it to the platforms, but let their secretaries of state know and let their local election officials know, because that's the best way for election officials to put out information about what might be inaccurate online and address it very quickly if they know about it. If they don't know about it, it's hard for them to act quickly. So we're also encouraging that, which I think is really, really important in the next 4 weeks.
Yeah, for sure. And then, so for Allison, as a county election official yourself, take us behind the scenes a little bit to how your county is prepared for the next 4 weeks of voting to sort of ensure that it's safe and secure and to deal with the major uptick in mail ballots in Maryland.
Oh, behind the scenes, we're hard at work. I did a panel with some other election officials from the West Coast on Super Tuesday, and I explained to the audience in that room how the East Coast did not vote by mail. A few weeks later, we were conducting an election entirely by mail. Everything that we planned for has changed, but everything that we're doing is things that we had planned for. We have always conducted elections by mail to an extent. It's just the volume that is so much higher than what we've done before. But we're nimble. We roll with these things. That's what we do for a living, and we apply the creativity and the resources and the manpower that we have. So certainly we have certain kinds of challenges. Social distancing means that everything needs to spread out. That includes behind the scenes of our office. And so we did things like take all of our training for our in-person voting off-site so that we could convert our entire facility to a mail operation. We have humans handling ballots, sorting ballots, matching up ballots with voter registration records so that we can go ahead and open those ballots and count them by election day. I think the main thing that voters need to know is that election officials are your neighbors. We are your government officials. We are your county and city officials and state officials. And we're on this. We are working really hard at this. In our case, we've had the resources of our entire county brought to bear. We have employees from multiple other departments here working side by side with us, recreation department employees who have learned to be voter registration specialists. and are helping us out to get the job done so that every voter is going to have that opportunity to vote and have that ballot counted.
Great, yeah. And so then the second thing I want to touch on is both the outbreak of COVID-19 that's currently sweeping through the highest levels of the White House and the Trump administration. And in addition to that, we're seeing an uptick in COVID-19 cases nationwide after, a sort of a downturn over the past couple months. I believe there's a rolling average of nearly 44,000 new cases by day, which as it gets closer up to the election could be very problematic. So I want to start with you, Secretary Oliver. I know one of the biggest things you've been focused on in your time in office is election security and integrity. And with the uptick in COVID cases, including among, the highest levels of government, why should voters, feel confident in the security of their elections this year and in the integrity of mail ballots as we're seeing an increase in cases?
Sure. Well, election security is nothing new to election officials around the country. Certainly, the focus on cybersecurity has really taken so much of our time and bandwidth over the last 4 years, especially since the 2016 election. And I think that really the work that has been done between state, local, and federal partners is really a model for how to drastically improve communication, drastically improve planning, and to bring the full tools and resources available from the federal government to state and local governments to help protect their systems. So bear in mind, that work has been ongoing for certainly since before 2016, but in this very robust and partnering kind of way, especially since 2016. But then the point you raised, Grace, is really important, that now we throw the pandemic into the mix, and this creates a whole new level of election challenges, security issues, because election security isn't just about protecting our voting systems and voter registration systems. It's about protecting physical polling locations. It's about protecting people at the polls, the poll workers, as well as the voters, right? And so now we're having to layer on COVID safe practices, PPE, the whole gamut of, how do you clean and sanitize a location, all the way down to, can you clean and sanitize the pens that are used for marking the ballot, things like this, right? So we've added that layer on top of everything else. But here's the really important point to make about absentee voting. And my colleagues on this call know about this even better than I do in many cases, because as I mentioned before, we are really shifting from a state that didn't do very much voting by mail to, I think, the vast majority of the votes that will be counted in New Mexico on November 3rd will be votes that have come through the mail. Making sure that we are in very close touch with the U.S. Postal Service, for example, has been a huge part of election integrity and security, to build in accountability, to build in, for example, tracking of the ballot here in New Mexico through the use of the Postal Service intelligent mail barcodes, so you can track your ballot like an Amazon package. These are all new and added components to help continue to maintain the safety of voters, the integrity of the voting process, and the safety of absentee voting in general.
Yeah, definitely. And so then for you, Secretary Wyman, you've been in a unique position this year as a Republican elected official in a state that runs all-mail voting, which both the President of the United States and many of the other people in his orbit who have now tested positive for COVID-19 have spent the year railing against and spreading a lot of misinformation about. Do you believe that this new COVID outbreak, that the President has now experienced and many others in his inner circle, do you think that'll change at all their tune about vote by mail and sort of the necessity of it in a pandemic?
I hope so, but the way that 2020 has gone, I'm not counting on that to happen. So, really where we're spending our time is trying to educate voters both here in Washington and quite frankly across the country of the security measures that are built into vote by mail and absentee voting. I think there's been a lot of attention paid and certainly made by the president that there's a very significant difference between the two. But I'll tell you, it's just a nuanced difference. An absentee ballot is requested by a voter. A vote by mail ballot is sent to you by government. And I think that kind of really helps understand why you get this very partisan reaction in a lot of ways to vote by mail and absentee voting. Ultimately, going back to kind of what Maggie just talked about, Secretary Toulouse Oliver talked about, really our job as election officials is to make sure that all of our voters have an option and have a choice that's going to make sense for their life, for their schedule, and for the safety of their families. And that's what every election official in this country has been focused on for the last 6 months, is how do we make sure our voters can be safe? And we're going to continue doing that. So whether the president suddenly has a turnaround and sees the light and knows how good vote by mail elections are, or if he continues on the path he is, we're going to continue to say the message that we have all along, that it's a secure method. We have options for you to return it by a drop box or by a mailbox. Make sure you get a postmark on election day if you're in a state like mine. And if you are in a state that needs to have it in the door by a cutoff, use a ballot drop box and get it to election officials.
Yeah, definitely. That's great to know. And so then for you, Allison, this outbreak in the White House and the uptick in cases in the DC area hits very close to home for you in Montgomery County. Tell us about how your county is sort of preparing for another spike in COVID-19 cases and how that could affect things, in the week before the election, if people suddenly get sick and, think that they may not be able to vote in person and may have to request a mail ballot at the last minute, sort of how we're planning for, another rise in COVID cases.
Well, this election is all about voters' choices. And the more that voters exercise an array of choices, the less that we have voters crowded into close quarters. And so we have purchased a number of drop boxes around the county so that voters do have that opportunity to either request their ballot and return it by mail or return it in a drop box, or they can go to one of our in-person vote centers, and voters are going to be able to go to any one of the vote centers in our county, and we're going to be tracking the wait time so that if we do have certain sites that really have far too many voters going to them, then we'll be able to direct voters to the other locations. It's all about giving voters the choices so that they can, knowing what their situation is, be able to exercise the franchise in the best way that works for them. And for us, it's all just about safety, 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 caution. We are not allowing the public into the facilities where we are doing the work of the election, but we're using live streaming for the first time so that voters are able to see elements of that process. We've opened parts of the process up to public observation, but we have to be very deliberative and very intentional about how we stage that so that we can keep our own staff safe so they can perform their duties through the election. We do not want to be one of the local county offices that has had to experience a shutdown because of lapses in safety precautions or, an ill-timed challenge. So we've got backups for the fallback plans, and we've got staff who are cross-trained, and we just make sure that we've got all of the resources to bear to be able to support whatever the voters choose to do.
Great. And so then another big concern that a lot of people have raised, not just about potential voter fraud, which we know is very rare, but also a lot of concern about the high rates of ballots that have been rejected so far this year. An NPR analysis from a couple months ago found that over 500,000 mail ballots have been rejected so far in this year's primaries, which surpasses the number that were rejected in the 2016 presidential election. And yesterday, Trey Traynor, who is the Republican chairman of the Federal Election Commission, wrote in an op-ed in the National Review, he said that he believes, based on his decades of practicing election law, I can unequivocally state that the best way to make sure your vote counts in this election is to vote in person. Mail ballots are the low-hanging fruit in an election contest and the easiest way to put the true outcome of an election into question and thereby allow the courts to determine the winner. The situation is easily remedied by Americans simply showing up at the polls and voting in person. So Amber, for you, as the CEO of the National Vote at Home Institute and someone who has personally implemented vote by mail yourself, how would you respond to Commissioner Traynor's argument there?
Well, I think first and foremost, Commissioner Traynor hasn't run an election, so that's clear with those comments. But secondly, I think it also fails to recognize the other side of in-person voting that can impact voters, including potentially voting a provisional ballot. Provisional ballots are actually going to be the last ballots processed and counted, not mail ballots. And provisional ballots have high rejection rates in some states, and often they're issued because voters missed the voter registration deadline, didn't have the proper ID, whatever that, maybe they moved within the period of time and they don't meet the residency requirement. So there's a lot of provisionals that will be issued and also rejected in a lot of states. And so, I think we have to be thoughtful about how we talk about these different data elements. And on the mail ballot rejection piece in particular, there also have been a lot of adjustments this year with either with litigation or other policy and law changes that will dramatically improve that. So one of the big issues with vote by mail or absentee voting is late ballots. And a lot of states have made adjustments to accept postmark, accept ballots post-election day to be sure that all eligible votes are counted accordingly. And so we'll see that number and that percentage go down because a lot of those policy adjustments have happened. And then secondly, the most important thing in ensuring that the ballot is tabulated and accepted as voters expect is that voters follow instructions. So, if it says to include a secrecy sleeve, which Pennsylvania is on an island, they are going to reject a ballot if it doesn't include the secrecy. But if it says to include it, make sure you do so. Make sure you fill in the ovals. Make sure you sign where it says to sign. So it's really critical, just like it is with in-person voting, to follow the instructions.
Definitely. And so then for you, Secretary Wyman, I know that Washington transitioned to holding all mail elections after a really hotly contested and disputed gubernatorial election in 2004 that went to a recount. So since then, what features of Washington's election infrastructure have been built to ensure the confidence in mail voting and to avoid these kind of drawn out litigation contests that some people are expressing fear about?
Well, remember, the drawn-out litigation contests come from close elections. So every election official knows that you're just one election away from being in the center of the hurricane and the eye of the storm. So we all prepare for that. And I think Washington's experience in 2004, where we had a governor's race that had 2 statewide recounts and a 6-month court case. At the end of all of that, 133 votes separated the winner from the loser out of 2.8 million cast. It is not something I would wish on anyone, but we all know that we could be one election away from it. So I think every election official is preparing for that. And what we've learned from that experience is really the accountability piece. We had counties that counted provisional ballots that were ineligible. At the polling places, we had counties that lost trays of ballots, and this happened in multiple counties. It became front page news across the country, as a matter of fact. So really it's about the control measures, making sure that you can account for every single ballot you've received and tell people at the end of the election whether it was counted or not, and if it was rejected, why it was rejected. So that's the first area. The second area was building out the capacity. We were fortunate because some of our bigger counties, like King County, where Seattle is, had 5 years to really adapt their systems and come in and have a lean assessment and have 6 Sigma levels of accuracy applied to their processes. So unfortunately, a lot of states haven't had that. And so they're going to just wing it and they're going to do a great job, but they're going to hold themselves to the same types of standards. And then finally, it's about consistency. Probably the single most important thing that counties within a state can do. It's so important. And we learned this in Gore v. Bush. It is important that a ballot in King County is treated the same as a ballot in Spokane County. And it goes to all of the things you've already heard. The voter circles the name of the candidate they want instead of filling in the oval. That ballot won't be counted if you run it through the reader that way. So you have to have processes and procedures in place so that ballot is treated exactly the same for the voter across the state that does the same mistake. And so it's really doing those controls, consistency, and then managing the resources that will make the difference.
Absolutely, yeah. And so then for you, Secretary Oliver, as someone who leads an organization of statewide election officials, how do you sort of see, things playing out this year? Do you expect for there to be a huge increase in ballots being rejected or disqualified? And, what sort of steps can be taken between now and November 3rd to mitigate this nightmare scenario that some people are predicting?
I would echo a lot of what my colleagues have said, particularly about following the instructions on the voter side of the equation, and of course having adequate processes of accountability and curing to the extent possible on the administrative side. So, just to reiterate a couple of important points, I think that probably because we had so many voters voting by mail for the very first time. In fact, I voted for the first time as an absentee voter in our primary election in June. I always go and vote early. And even though we do conduct some elections by mail here in New Mexico, it was my first time specifically requesting an absentee ballot and returning it. And as I was going myself through that process for the first time, I often refer to myself as everyone's personal election concierge. I'm very accessible. Lots of folks have my number. People are calling me, literally asking me questions about, what do I put in this spot that says, election date? Well, is it today's date or is it the date of the election, right? Things like that. So again, making sure that you read the instructions that come with your ballot, following them step by step, and picking up the phone and calling your local county election official if you have questions before you seal it up and put it back in the mail is always a great way to go. They would so much rather answer those questions and be able to count that ballot. We had a pretty low rejection rate in our primary election, despite the fact that we had so many new absentee voters. But even then, states like mine have gone through a process to even further streamline and to add what we call curing in the election administration world, which is if we do get a ballot back that has a problem, let's say a missing signature or a mismatched signature, in the case of the states that do signature comparison, or some other crucial piece of information, your election official has to follow a process to get a hold of you to try and help you correct that in many places. And so if you're applying for an absentee ballot, or in any situation where you're voting by mail, making sure your contact information is completely up to date is a really important thing that we're encouraging voters to do, because if there is a problem with your ballot, that way your local election official can get a hold of you right away so it can get fixed right away.
Definitely. And then so for Allison, I know you're both a county election official and a longtime expert on policy. And Maryland has been a site of a lot of these big sort of policy debates, including, I know you all have expanded the use of drop boxes, as you were saying, and the debate over when election officials can begin processing mail ballots. So from your vantage point, how have all these different policy debates played out for you? And what's your general read on all the different disputes that are still playing out in the courts right now on some of these issues and have gotten a lot of attention?
Well, we've been fortunate in Maryland that the laws that we have and the processes that we're following are, in many cases, they are the laws and the processes that people are pursuing in court in other states. So we are not in that situation right now. We're sitting in a pretty good situation where we have the ability to open the ballots earlier and get started on that process. So we will be able to begin reporting election results on election night. And we also have the ability to accept ballots that have been postmarked on election day and received, in our case, up to 10 days after election day. So we're doing pretty well on that front. The biggest concern that we have is that it feeds anxiety for voters. Voters are hearing all of this talk about these issues in the national media, on social media. And so I'm spending much of my day fielding those emails and those phone calls and reach out on social media from voters who were worried about whether their ballot is going to be rejected based on some technicality that they heard of in some other state. And my answer is always, no, you're fine. Your ballot is going to count under the laws and the processes in our state. But I'm really glad that people are doing that. They're reaching out. And I would encourage everyone, first and foremost, yes, you hear these questions, and those are appropriate questions for you to be asking, but you want to go to your county office's website, your county election or registrar's website, and you want to find the information for yourself. If you can't find the information on what the answers are for your county, then pick up that phone or send an email or go ahead and reach out. Most of us are on social media, and that can be a really good way for you to reach your local election official and get your questions answered. We want you to have the information because we want you also to then be able to help inform your friends and family and neighbors about the processes and to know that voting by mail is a safe and secure option. You also have in-person opportunities if you need them.
Yeah, that's a really great point too, that, your local and state election officials are always the best and most accurate source of information, especially when we have so many of these court rulings that are back and forth. These policies are changing by the day, and it's even hard for people like me who are obsessed with this stuff to keep track of. So that's a really important point. And then the last thing I wanted to touch on with all of you before we start taking some viewer questions are about looking at voter turnout. Historically, the United States has not been a leader in the developed world in terms of voter turnout rates and getting voters out to the polls or voting by mail. And so the pandemic has presented obviously new challenges when it comes to voting, but it's also really highlighted the importance of voting and who our elected officials are. And we could be on track for record turnout this year. As we mentioned, there are over 4 million people who have already voted, and we're already at 16, 17, 18% turnout in some states of 2016 turnout in some states like Wisconsin, Virginia, Michigan, seeing a lot of mail ballots being returned. It's very exciting. And so I want to start with you, Amber. You've talked a lot in your work about the dangers and consequences of low voter turnout. And you noted that in 2016, if didn't vote was a candidate, it would have won in a landslide. So could this year be the turning point where we start having voter turnout that's more on par with the rest of the developed world?
Yes, I actually think that we are going to have by far the highest record turnout in that we've ever seen, and we're already seeing indicators of that. The interest in the election on all sides of the aisle, it doesn't matter what your partisan politics are, is high. And then there's counties actually, and there was one county I saw on Twitter today in Virginia that has reported that 30% of people have already voted, and it's we're almost a month away. So we are going to see record turnout, but that also tracks with some of the policy adjustments that we've had to make with the pandemic, because the reality is the states with the highest turnout have policy consistencies. That includes all 3 of the traditional vote by mail states are always in the top 7 or 8 states for turnout. Same day registration and other modifications that make the process easier for voters, early voting, all the states with the most options and the least barriers always rank consistently at the highest level in terms of turnout. So because of the pandemic, a lot of adjustments have had to be made this year. And the fact of the matter is it's up to voters to decide what voting option works for them. It's not up to partisan politicians in Washington, D.C. to decide for the rest of us how we're going to vote. It's up to voters to decide. And the great thing this year is that they get a lot of choices, more choices than they've ever had in various states. A lot of states have had to adapt and adjust quickly. New York has early voting and no excuse absentee for the first time. A lot of people don't cover that like they should, but that's a fact. And so, there is going to be extraordinarily high turnout. And what's great is that election officials are working night and day to be the guardians of democracy, put voters first, and ensure that there's a fair process for all that watch this election, and ensure that there's accuracy throughout the process, which is the most important piece.
Yeah, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this too, Secretary Oliver, as the president of the National Association of Secretaries of State. Could this be, a major inflection point where we start having more voter turnout, both presidential and local elections?
I think so. I agree with Amber. We are seeing those indicators throughout the country. We're seeing them here in my state. I think, in addition to just sort of heightened interest about the political process, I also think that the pandemic itself has brought the importance of the day-to-day lives of elected officials. The decisions that they make impact us in our day-to-day lives to a heightened degree during this pandemic, right? Whether or not you can even go to the grocery store and when, and whether or not you can gather with a group to, celebrate a birthday or an occasion, right? Basically, these sort of things that we would never have thought about or never even contemplated in a pre-COVID-19 world are all of a sudden front and center for all of us. And we are all really realizing, even if we haven't before, right, the importance of these decisions that get made. So I think that we are going to see an incredibly high turnout this year. And I think that, of course, that also has potential consequences. I think the consequences are good for our democracy. I am a personal believer in as broad and robust participation as possible. I think that speaks better for our democracy, and we elect leaders that look more like the American people and make decisions that are reflective of that. But, kind of steering us back to one of the main topics of this conversation, it also means we're going to have a lot more ballots to count, right? And again, to reiterate what Amber said and what all of my colleagues have said, the states that have the most options, whether you can, get an absentee ballot in the mail, you can go to an early voting site, we have a long period of early voting. We have many places to choose from, right? We don't have to go to one specific designated place that may have a line down the block. We can go, a mile or two up the road to a place that doesn't have a long wait, right? In states that have those kind of options, it is going to be a much smoother process, both for administrators and for voters. And so I think, to the extent possible, I just want to reiterate that voters should take advantage of any early option they can. Do not wait until election day unless that's your only option, because that's going to help us. I think one of you, I forget who said flatten the curve on the voting process. I thought that was so smart. So we don't have a bunch of folks waiting till the last minute on election day trying to make their voice heard in this democracy. So that's just a potential warning about all this wonderful turnout that I think we are going to see.
Great. Yeah, that's a really good point too. Now we have questions coming in from the viewers watching the panel, which is very exciting. So first, we have a question from Jordan, who asks, can the speakers comment on the concerns about mail-in ballots with the U.S. Postal Service experiencing delays in delivering mail across the country? How warranted are these concerns? I think, anyone who wants to.
I think that they are always concerns. Anything that can diminish voter confidence in the process or has even the appearance of trying to put a finger on the scale to tip anything in the favor of one party or to discourage the other or to disparage the other party is a threat to our election system, and it's very problematic. I think that states across the country, going back to July, received letters that reminded us of delivery times. Standard delivery times for our nonprofit bulk rate mailings here in Washington were a concern. We felt that our mailing dates were going to be fine, but we were concerned. In fact, we made a rule change in administrative code to ensure that our counties would be mailing out at first class rates as we got closer to election day. With that said, though, there has also been litigation that has happened in multiple states and have joined my attorney general filed a suit against the USPS with, I think, 11 or 12 other states. And I know there were multiple suits like that, and they have really helped define what the post office is doing. It stopped them, which was a good thing, because even if their changes didn't have an impact on any kind of processing, the appearance of it was there. Our voters were starting to lose confidence. My voters were calling because they were concerned in August after our primary that their general election ballots wouldn't arrive in time. So we had to spend a lot of time on messaging and really reassuring people that they were going to have plenty of time to receive a ballot and vote it. And in our state, we have over 500 ballot drop boxes to deposit them in. So, again, it was nice to be in that position, but it does have an impact across the country. We are concerned. And, Colorado lawsuit, I know one of the things that she was addressing Secretary Griswold when she sued the USPS was about a postcard that they sent out across the country that had misinformation for vote by mail states. I can tell you that was very irritating for states like ours because our voters were getting information that wasn't true or accurate. So we, again, had to spend time educating our voters and have reached out to the post office, who we have a very good relationship with, the Postal Service, to remind them that, you might want to, check with election officials before you start putting out information about elections. And maybe we would all be better served by that. So I think that our relationship is still growing in some states where it's newer, and we're going to keep working on it. But we're trying to inspire confidence in our voters, and we have to do that in partnership with the USPS. We can't be working against each other.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Secretary. Yeah.
I'd like to speak to that one too, if I may. I mean, in our case, as a jurisdiction where we have an enormous growth in the vote by mail, we are not seeing delays at this point. Certainly the national discussion about this is very important for our voters. And that's why we went ahead and bought a whole lot of drop boxes. We've got a drop box at every high school in our county that voters are going to be able to bring their ballots to, because we hear the concerns. But we've also been spot checking the mail that comes in, and the mail that we're getting is postmarked a day or two before we're receiving it. If you're getting your mail, we're getting our mail, is pretty much the rule of thumb that I would say that voters should go by. So while it's important to keep an ear on these issues and let it be a reminder to you to request your ballot early and to return your ballot early, don't let it stop you from voting by mail. Don't overthink what the risk may be. A lot of what you're hearing about ballot rejection rates is not applicable to your situation necessarily. Certainly we do reject ballots because they are received too late, because they are not postmarked by election. A lot of ballots that voters do put in the mail stream after the election date has passed, and we have to reject those ballots. But if you're requesting your ballot now and you're returning your ballot by now, we're going to have it this week.
Yeah,
Right.
and I would just add too that I think the Dropbox conversation is critical, and it relates directly to this. And this is exactly why expanding those options, putting the service out in front of voters, meeting voters where they are in their everyday lives, especially with options like drop boxes, are so critically important. And so the fact that drop boxes have also managed to be politicized this year, along with the Postal Service, along with election administration, along with vote by mail, is pretty incredible, because it provides a service for all electors that engage with the vote by mail process. And we actually know from a lot of research studies and different polling and frankly, our history with vote by mail in various states, that voters like to get their ballot mailed, their unvoted ballot mailed to them, but many voters prefer to drop off that voted ballot and submit it in person, because that gives them more confidence and they know that it's secure and it actually gets to election officials faster. So the Dropbox conversation is actually directly relevant for the operations at the Postal Service, and a very important aspect of a good vote by mail system that provides lots of options for voters to engage with it.
Yeah, definitely. That's a really good point too about drop boxes. Next, we have a question from Rachel Ori, who asks, with all the noise and misinformation around by-mail voting, as well as concerns that a blue shift as ballots are counted could delegitimize results, what do you recommend to voters who think that in-person voting is the best way to support election administrators? Anyone who wants can start with that one.
I think we've touched on it a few times already, but the best way to support election administrators is to vote as early as you can and not wait till the last minute. Whether it's applying for and getting your ballot in the mail now, or going to vote early at, maybe not the very earliest opportunity, but maybe a day or two after early voting starts, when we usually see a little bit of a dip. Basically, as long as we don't see every single voter trying to vote by the exact same mechanism at the exact same time, that's when election administrators are going to really feel a lot of stress and a lot of crunch, and voters are going to feel a lot of stress and a lot of crunch. So, for voters who are thinking strategically, like apparently this person is, think about, getting your ballot as soon as possible and returning it as soon as possible, or going and voting early if you have that option. Another thing to do for those voters who have to go and vote on election day, which again, I say is your last chance. It's election day, but it's really your last chance to vote, right? In most places, think about going mid-morning or mid-afternoon. It's usually the beginning, middle, and end of the day that has the largest rush. So that's something you can do if you're in that limited circumstance. But basically, make a plan. Figure out now how you want to vote, figure out that timing, and do try to get that vote in as soon as possible. That is the best way to support your election administrators.
Yeah, definitely. Does anyone else want to add anything to that? That was a really comprehensive answer.
The only
Yeah,
thing,
and I'll just chime in.
Oh, go ahead, Allison.
Well, I'll jump in.
Yeah.
I think the only thing that I would want to add to that is this is another one of the situations where you shouldn't necessarily assume that the national narrative is true in your state or is true in your county. In our case, it has certainly been true in the past that the ballots returned by mail were the very last ones that we would be counting. That's no longer true. The ballots that are being returned by mail to our office now are going to be the first ballots that you're going to see results for on election night. It really just depends on your state.
And I would just add, I think another way for voters to help support local election officials as well as state officials is to boost what the local election officials are putting out in terms of information. So, a lot of third-party groups are throwing out a ton of voter information. Campaigns have information out, all that. But boosting the voice of your local election officials that are the trusted source of information, they're the ones that are counting and tallying the results, sharing their posts, sharing their Twitter feeds, sharing the Facebook posts, like that spreads good information. So whatever folks can do, that's very important. And it's also a great way to support election officials with a few clicks on your phone. You can do it quickly. And I totally agree with everything else that has been said here. Make a plan, do it early. If you wait till election day, you only have one plan, because that's plan A. If you do it early, you've got a plan A, and then you have a plan B, which is election day.
Yeah, definitely. That's a really good point too. Yeah. And also, as Allison mentioned, in some states that allow pre-processing before election day, the mail ballots are actually the first to be counted. So you might see a slight shift instead of a blue shift. So that is one important thing to keep in mind. And then the next question we have is from Collier from the Bipartisan Policy Center. And she wants to know, she says, a lot of voters are now getting concerned about vote by mail. Some have already requested ballots, but now want to vote in person instead. What do you say to these people?
Well,
that's another one of those local questions.
Go ahead, Alison.
No, it's another one of those local questions. We in our state, I'm telling those people to please take that ballot to a drop box. If that voter goes to a polling place and does not bring the ballot that they put into a drop box, that's a voter in my state that is going to have to vote a provisional ballot at the polls, which is probably the last thing that they want to do. In another state, the advice may be different. So it's one that you really want to go to your local election officials about and find out the answer straight from the source.
And I would just add, we have a paper that we've drafted on this topic. What happens if you decide late in the game that you don't want to vote your mail ballot and you go in person? And actually, it's interesting because a lot of people are saying, well, I'd rather vote in person because I'd be first in the batch of results. If you do this, and exactly what Allison just said, if you do that, you're actually potentially going to put yourself at the back of the line because you're going to end up with a provisional. Those are actually processed at the very end after everything else. And in most states, honestly, vote by mail tallies and results are in the first batch, especially those that have come in early and what have you. And that's true in a lot of states. There's only really a few groups of states that cannot process early. Most states can. And so the fact is you're potentially going to put yourself at the end of the line if you show up after you've requested a mail ballot in a lot of states.
Yeah, sorry, did you want to add to that, Secretary Wyman?
They got it all. Nailed it.
Perfect. Great. Then we have a question from Michael Epling, who says there are a number of active legal challenges to the vote by mail process in Georgia, Pennsylvania, Florida, Wisconsin, Texas. Will these be resolved by the election, and what impact will they have?
From what I've heard from my colleagues on different calls that I've been on in the last couple months, there have been to date over 200 lawsuits filed across the country in local and state election offices. And this is not going to let up. It's going to continue. There is no doubt in my mind that this will be the most litigated election in our country's history. And I think it comes back to 20 years ago. Gore v. Bush taught people on campaigns that if you can't win at the box, sue and you might win in court. And that has been reinforced and has been a practice, I think, a standard part of practice for many campaigns on both the left and the right. And it's not going to end anytime soon. And it is just going to be one more thing we're navigating in this election, in my opinion.
And I would add that the litigation is certainly going to continue. Litigation happens when the laws aren't clear, and the fact is, a lot of states have outdated laws on the books that don't work very well for election officials, and by extension, don't work very well for voters. So some of the litigation is trying to solve good problems. Other types of litigation is creating more problems. So there's sort of a mixed bag, as we've seen. And what I would also say is late in the game litigation, and there's still a lot of it happening. It has the biggest impact on election officials, which means that voters are going to feel that impact in one way or another, whether it's confusing communications that are coming out because they were told one thing and now it's different. But election officials and voters are the ones that are the most impacted by litigation, and it certainly is challenging, but it's also necessary sometimes. And a lot of the litigation that's happening right now is absolutely necessary to help voters be successful in the voting process.
Yeah, definitely. Does anyone else have anything they want to say on the litigation front? All right. And now I have another question from Hannah, who asks, what should voters do if they receive someone else's mail-in ballot, or if a mail-in ballot is sent to someone who no longer lives at their home? I know the first thing has been an issue here in New York City, where I live. How common are these occurrences, and should they be cause for concern about ballot security?
Well, I don't think it's very common to the extent that it happens, and this may be a particular occurrence in vote by mail states, which I'm sure my colleagues who have run universal vote by mail elections can speak to that. But at the end of the day, it comes down to this thing that we've been saying over and over again on this presentation today, which is contact your local election official. The reality is that elections are run by human beings. It's a human process. Mistakes get made. Voters move without updating their current information. And a lot of states have really great processes to keep this to a real bare minimum. But I can't think of a single election that I've ever been a part of or that's ever been conducted where something unusual hasn't happened. I think that what a voter should do is, rather than jumping to conclusions about the integrity of the election process, first contact their local county official, find out why it might be in their possession, what might have happened, and what the best way is to dispose of that ballot. Because the thing to keep in mind is that everywhere a mail ballot and tampering with something that has come to you through the mail that is not addressed to you is a felony. And then, of course, states have their own laws around, attempting to vote in another person's name. And these are really, really strict laws. And New Mexico, for example, it's a 4th-degree felony, and you can be charged with multiple of those felonies for tampering with a mail ballot. And then the upshot is that if you are prosecuted and convicted, then you too will at least temporarily lose your right to vote moving forward. So it's a very high risk, low reward scenario to try to do something nefarious with somebody else's ballot.
Just add to Secretary Oliver's comments that remember that 10% of our population moves every year. So over a 4-year period of time, when most voters actually participate, you have some pretty major changes, especially in certain demographics. Younger people, people who are in college or just young and starting out their lives, they move a lot more than their older counterparts. And so keeping up with that is a constant effort that every state and every local election official is constantly doing. But I can tell you, as we sit here right now, 100%, I know to my core that we have outdated information on our voter rolls. We have probably people who have passed away who are still getting a ballot because we haven't been notified or haven't been able to find that information. So I say that is the nature of any kind of election. And I think that states like ours that have mailed to every voter at least once a year are going to have a little cleaner rolls than those states like in New York, where this is brand new, quite honestly, to mail a ballot to every voter. So there is going to be multiple cases of voters receiving more than one ballot that are probably not theirs. And to answer the question, what you should do is write on that outer envelope that this voter no longer lives at this address, or if you know that they have passed away, that they're deceased, write whatever that information is that you know and put that back in the mail stream. The USPS will deliver it back to election officials, and then they can begin the process to clean up those rolls. The difficulty for us is that people move, and we're not the highest priority to remember to tell that you have a new address. And so don't think that just because 4 ballots came to your apartment where there have been 4 people in the last 4 years that have lived there, it's not fraud. It's not a mistake that's going to lead to fraud. It is the nature of a mobile population, especially in COVID. So just communicate with the election officials.
And what I would add, and no one's going to be surprised when I say this, but anytime these situations happen, usually we can trace it to a policy flaw. So in the states that have, for instance, automatic registration, automatic address updates, automatic interaction with the databases more effectively, members of ERIC, all of those things actually produce cleaner files, cleaner lists. When we automate the system and the machinery of government, whether it be at motor vehicle offices or other government systems where you have to provide your name and address and all the same information you have to provide for voting, when we automate that process, including the National Change of Address database that's managed by the Postal Service, when we automate updating addresses, it produces cleaner files, and it automates this process more effectively, so that the lists are cleaner. So, when we hear talk of integrity of the voter files, accuracy of the lists, usually we can look at those states' laws and trace it back to potentially a policy flaw. So we need to have a greater conversation around these issues, how they relate to the voting process itself, because it isn't just vote by mail. That also means that in a poll book somewhere, that person's information is also inaccurate, and they might show up to the wrong polling place. So we have to be very thoughtful about this, and it certainly all directly relates to the policy process.
Yeah, for sure. Does anyone else want to quickly add anything to that, or? All right, great. Yeah, so we're almost getting towards the end of our time together. So I just wanted to thank the 4 wonderful election officials and experts who have joined us today and given their thoughts on this process. And thanks to the Bipartisan Policy Center for allowing me to moderate this great discussion. In the last minute we have before I turn things back to Matt, does anyone have any final thoughts or things they want to share that I didn't get to? No? All right. Great. Thank you all so much. And just quickly, if I can ask one more thing quickly of Secretary Wyman, do you think that the rest of the country could be moving towards Washington's model of all-mail elections or massive expansions? And could that be a good policy change, in the post-COVID world?
Well, I'm biased because I am, like Amber McReynolds, the biggest advocate for voting at home in the country, I think. But with that said, I think it hinges on the success we have in November. If states are able to pull this off in a way that inspires confidence, I think you're going to see a whole bunch of voters wanting it and a demand for it. And I think if things go off the rails and it gets pinned on mistakes made in vote by mail elections, you're going to see a further, states trying to pull it back, and it will just become the same. The same partisan discussion it's been over the last 6 months.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Thanks for sharing that. And with that, thank you all so much for being here, and thank you everyone who tuned in. And I'll hand it back to Matt Weil, the Bipartisan Policy Center.
Well, I want to add my thanks to both Grace for moderating this panel and to all 4 of our panelists for being excellent. I also want to thank my team on BPC Elections Project. That's Rachel Collier, Michael Thorning, Alejandro, and our 2 great interns this fall, Owen and Hannah. And just let you know that we are going to have more reports coming out this election season. We have another event coming up on October 29th, which you'll be learning about soon. We encourage you to stay connected to BPC Elections at bipartisanpolicy.org/elections. Thank you for attending, and we'll see you soon.